This week's Dark Side of the Ring focused on Tony Halme, better known in the wrestling world as Ludvig Borga, who led quite the interesting life. He didn't last very long in WWE, all of 6 months, but he was also headlined in New Japan Pro Wrestling. He fought mixed martial arts, including he was Randy Couture's very first opponent in the UFC. He was a boxer, he was an author, he was an actor, he was a singer, he was a politician in the Finnish parliament. He was also a drug addict, an alcoholic, and a racist neo-Nazi piece of shit. Basically the exact opposite of what we saw last week in the episode on Mick Foley, who is regarded as one of the nicest people ever in the wrestling business. Borga was anything but. And that makes him perfect for a show like Dark Side of the Ring, even though the actual wrestling portion of the episode is actually pretty small, compared to the overall picture here. They interviewed a bunch of people here. One of them was the journalist who actually wrote Halme's biography, who said that he came from a broken home with his parents, divorcing when he was only 2 years old. So right off the bat, they give you an insight into what may have contributed to the type of person that he would grow up to become. You know, it may have shaped his experiences at a very young age, and that led to ultimately what we see here in this episode. But he was looked at as an outsider as a child. His mother enrolled him in a Swedish school, even though he was Finnish. And they also interviewed his childhood friend. They interviewed one of his ex-wives. Jim Ross was interviewed, Jim Cornette, both of whom worked with him in WWE and were around him. His ex-wife said that he desperately wanted to be famous. So he came up with this persona called the Viking. And this was years before he ever got into pro wrestling. He didn't even know of pro wrestling. He never watched it as a kid. He wasn't a fan of it. After he moved to the United States, he met his ex-wife, Dee Dee, and some guys in the gym one day suggested that he might want to become a pro wrestler because he had a unique look. He was a big guy. And that led to him joining the UWF as the Viking under Herb Abrams. Herb Abrams got a hold of this guy, another psychopath that's been given the Dark Side of the Ring treatment before. After that, he got his big break working in Japan. And they even had video of him wrestling Big Van Vader. He got a big push right out of the gate. He was not over nearly at the level that they pushed him at. But he had claimed to be the heavyweight boxing champion of Finland, which was bullshit. But they accepted him as a tough guy because he looked the part. You know, he looked like a big, scary guy, and people bought into it. He also beat his body to shit working that Japanese style. He got hooked on painkillers while he was over there. And they touched on the famous story of his fight with Scott Norton in Japan, and he and Norton actually held the IWGP tag team titles together at one point. But that all fell apart after at least one, if not two, very real fights that they had outside the ring. Now, I don't remember if it was in a bar or if it was in the locker room. I can't remember which. But in the episode, as they tell it, Halme was friendly with a lot of people who were either part of the White Brotherhood or were sympathetic to their cause. Okay, skinheads, basically. And the wrong word slipped out of his mouth one day, and Norton heard this. And it probably wasn't the first time that he heard something like this, but whatever it was, it finally set him off. This they didn't get into on the show, but they actually had one fight that got broken up by the other wrestlers. And then later that same night, Halme sucker punched Norton and knocked him out. And he didn't last too much longer after that. Before leaving Japan, he made the jump to WWE. Rick Bassman is the one who got him booked there. Like, literally, he wrestled for New Japan in June of 93 for the last time, and by July, he was working for Vince. And he actually debuted 2 days after Lex Luger slammed Yokozuna on the Intrepid. And Ludvig Borga was born. And Jim Cornette said, he was there for Borga's run. He talked about Vince McMahon's affinity for the foreign heel gimmick in wrestling. Borga had an accent, so that means he's got to be the foreign menace. He's going to be the foreign menace from Finland, the Hellraiser from Helsinki. And the thing I remember about Borga's run, other than how bad it was him being the man to end Tatanka's 2-year undefeated streak. And they interviewed Tatanka for this episode. And Tatanka said that he was told they wanted to do something big for Borga. So he starts talking about like what it means to give someone the rub. What does it mean for somebody to get the rub in wrestling, and how if you rub shoulders with Hulk Hogan, it takes you up to a higher level. Tatanka comparing himself to Hulk Hogan in any way, shape, or form, even in the form of an analogy, is almost as batshit crazy as any of the lies that Hogan himself has ever told. Like, I was floored by this. But I remember the match. Borga used the chair, and then he pinned him with one finger. And it was a big deal at the time because, again, Tatanka was protected for reasons I have no idea, but he was protected for 2 fucking years, like he's Roman Reigns. And then finally, Ludvig Borga comes in, and not only does he beat him, but he beats him with one finger on his chest. And Tatanka tells the producer that looking back at it now, Borga wasn't the right guy to end the streak. I think Repo Man should have been the guy, personally. But Tatanka has a very inflated opinion of himself. Jim Ross said that Borga had a great look, but he was a miserable human being, and he made the people around him very uncomfortable. Sounds like a great hire. And then came the kicker. When they come to find out, after he's already been hired, they come to find out, I guess this isn't the sort of thing you would volunteer. You would write in on your resume. But they come to learn that this man has an SS tattoo on his calf. They did not see that coming. You know, Kevin Nash once told a story of walking through the streets of Tel Aviv with Borga. They did a show there in '93. And that's when he first noticed the SS tattoo for the first time, while they were walking through the streets of Tel Aviv, of all places. And so we had Jim Cornette in the episode here give us a brief history lesson about the SS being Hitler's private army who carried out a lot of his atrocities. And JR admits, he goes, we made a mistake in hiring him. He slipped by us. Yes, he slipped by them like he snuck through the back door of the building and he just fell into a big push where he was wrestling Lex Luger. Just kind of snuck in the back door. The background checks back then were very lenient, indeed. So they had him cover the tattoo with tape because they had to. I mean, think about it. Think about the heat they would get with USA Network and all of the syndicated stations that they aired on if that tattoo was visible on TV. They had more kids back then than anybody else watching the product. The last thing they needed to see was a fucking Nazi tattoo on this guy. And his ex-wife says he was fascinated by Nazis, and he came back once from a trip to Russia with a pitcher, and it had a swastika on the bottom of it. And she used it in their house as a flower pot. And she claimed that she was naive and she didn't know shit from Shinola at that age. Had no idea what it meant. And even more bizarre than the Nazi tattoo, that wasn't the only tattoo they talked about here in this episode. I already knew about the Nazi tattoo. What I didn't know about was the exit-only tattoo on his lower back right above his ass. And his ex-wife questions why someone would get such a tattoo. I mean, I don't know. You were married to him. Perhaps you should have had that conversation one day. They showed a photo of the tattoo, by the way, which I did not need to see. And Cornette had the line of the episode here. And he asked the question, which is a perfectly logical question to ask. What the fuck would compel a man to tattoo exit only above his asshole? Do you really need written instructions for people not to fuck you in the ass? The man's got a point. I mean, is he worried that at his next physical, the doctor might try to fuck him in the ass? I would suggest you find a new doctor if you've run into that problem before, and give that man a 1-star review on Yelp. So you can add raging homophobe to the list of wonderful personality traits that this man possessed. Borga's WWE career really can be distilled down to this. Vince McMahon brought him in to be the lead foreign heel after Yokozuna against Lex Luger. And then, as Bruce Pritchard says, the bell rang. And it was like the blind leading the blinded there. Now, maybe after Luger won the title at WrestleMania 10, they would have used Borga as a first challenger for Luger to beat. I don't know. We know what happened to those plans for Lex to win the title at WrestleMania. But Lex had already beaten him at Survivor Series, and nobody had any reason to want to see the match after that. I mean, they didn't have a reason to want to see the match before that, because it wasn't any good. And as it turned out, Borga broke his ankle in a match against Rick Steiner at Madison Square Garden a few days before the Royal Rumble, and that was the end of his career there. He was supposed to be back in time for WrestleMania 10 against Earthquake. You can even find the match graphic floating around online to promote the match. But his ankle didn't heal up in time, and so they ended up going with Earthquake against Atom Bomb instead, and Borga just never returned. Now Pritchard has said that he got out of shape during his time off, and he just wanted to go back home. So they saw the chance to make a clean break, and they let him go. In this episode here, JR said that Borga got hurt, and nobody missed him. And he was glad that Borga did not get hired on his watch. Funny enough, not only did Borga's injury derail his career, Bret Hart was so over in that 94 Royal Rumble match, that's what convinced Vince McMahon to change his mind and go with Bret to win the belt at WrestleMania instead of Luger. So Borga was never going to get a shot at the title, probably regardless. He did get a shot at the Intercontinental title. And not only that, he won the championship twice in the same match. It was a Coliseum video match they taped at the end of 93. It was against Razor Ramon. I don't know how many of you know about this. First, he pinned Razor even though Razor's foot was on the bottom rope, and the referee didn't see it. But then he restarted the match. And on the second try, Shawn Michaels ran in with his Intercontinental belt, and he whacked Razor in the back with it after the referee got bumped, so he didn't see it. And Borga pinned Razor for a second time. He got 2 pinfalls over Scott Hall in this match, and this time he actually celebrated with the title before a bunch of other referees ran in like the little snitches they are, and the decision got reversed. But technically, on this night, Ludvig Borga, he pinned Razor Ramon twice and won the Intercontinental title. So after his career was over there, he did some boxing, and then he had his one and only MMA fight in May of 1997. So at the same time that Ken Shamrock, who fought in the UFC, was making his WWE debut against Vader, Halme was making his UFC debut at UFC 13 against the debuting Randy Couture, who would only go on to become one of the greatest fighters of all time and future UFC Hall of Famer. A little backstory to this is that they did not get into this here. But there were 2 other guys that Halme was scheduled to fight on that show. And each of them backed out when they saw how big he was, right? This big 300-plus pound guy, probably juiced to the gill on horse steroids. So they backed out, and that's when Couture stepped in. And Halme never took it seriously. He showed up to train a few days before the fight. One of the students there put him in an armbar and popped his elbow. But when it came time to fight, Halme's out there, he's bragging that, nobody can make me tap out. And in the end, it took just under a minute for him to tap out. And that was the beginning and the end of his MMA career. Like, if you look at his Wikipedia page, he's got 5 MMA fights listed to his name. Those other 4 were not real MMA fights. He, quote-unquote, fought in the Rings promotion in Japan. And those were worked like a shoot, but they were a work. I think years later it turned into a shoot in Rings, but that came later on. So they talked about his home being raided one day, and he was charged with trafficking controlled substances, that being steroids. He was charged with illegal firearms possession. He went to prison. And some of the inmates there recognized him as Ludvig Borga, so they took him in. And of course, who took him in? The White Brotherhood took him in. What a shock. So then he gets deported back to Finland, and he is no longer allowed back in the United States. And after that, he joined the Finnish version of American Gladiators. He played a Viking character on the show. He recorded a song that sold so well, he ended up recording an entire album. And they also showed him in the movie Die Hard with a Vengeance, which is one of my all-time favorite movies and one of the most quotable movies. The OG Die Hard, still the best one, but if you said the third one was, I would not argue with you. They are the 2 best ones in the entire series. And Halme had a bit part in the movie. Mostly it was a non-speaking role as one of the foreign bad guys. I recognized him straight away the first time I ever watched the movie. I said, what the hell is Ludvig Borga doing in Die Hard? Obviously, he filmed that before he got deported. That movie came out in 1995. He was deported in 1999. And it was a bit role, but it made him an even bigger star in Finland. And then he wrote a book. Actually, he wrote multiple books. And there were a lot of exaggerated stories about his life. There was a lot of hateful, offensive shit in those books. And that paved the way for his entry into politics. And there was a far, far right-wing party, or as his advisor at the time said in the episode, a kind of Nazi party that brought him in to run for parliament. And to borrow one of those quotable lines from Die Hard with a Vengeance, birds of a feather flock together. And that was the case with Halme. There was a recession in Finland at the time. All of the immigrants there became scapegoats for everybody else's problems. And he was a charismatic guy, which appealed to people because he wasn't your typical politician. And I'm not going to get into some of the specific things that he said because it's repulsive, but it appealed to a certain segment of the population. And it ended up getting him elected. And that didn't stop him from saying outlandish, offensive things to get attention in the media because in his mind, even after he was elected, it was all about getting as much publicity and as much attention as possible. I'm sure he did believe a lot of the shit that he said, but even if he didn't, he would say the most outlandish things because he knew it would get coverage. But he was also addicted to drugs and alcohol. He literally had a bowl of drugs and would grab handfuls of pills at different times during the day. I think he talked about that in one of his books. And people around him started resigning because they had enough of it. Nobody could get through to him. There was an incident with his new wife where a gun got fired in their home. No one was hurt, but he swallowed his own puke. He ended up in a coma for several weeks. It was all over the news in Finland. They actually aired the trial on TV over there, like he was O.J. Simpson, over the gun charge. But anyway, he ends up in this coma, and he was able to pull through, but it was very clear to those around him that he had brain damage, permanent brain damage. He was not the same person. Very much like Terry Gordy, after he had that overdose on the plane. He lived several more years. I think that happened in 93, I want to say, and I think he died in 2000. And he wrestled, but Terry Gordy was never the same person, and he was never the same performer after the overdose. So his marriage failed again. He became depressed. He ended up getting charged in that shooting incident. He resigned from his position in Parliament. He was a mess. And people would see him. He'd be at the bar or whatever, and people would laugh and make fun of him. And, he would have piss on, he pissed himself. He was a mess. And he got into debt. He was buying drugs off the black market. He was committed to a mental institution for delirium because of all the drinking that he was doing. And one day his best friend showed up to his apartment. He couldn't get inside. Halme wouldn't answer, so he called the police. And when they got inside, they found him dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. And he was only 47 years old when he killed himself. And you might think, well, even in death, surely they can find some people to say nice things about this man. But you would be wrong. His ex-wife says that she wasn't surprised when she heard the news, and she did not shed a single tear. She said he was a piece of shit and treated people horribly. Jim Ross said he was an asshole, and that's where I'll leave it. I'll say one good thing about him. He once said in a speech before Parliament that every single pedophile should get their nuts cut off and thrown into a dungeon for the rest of their life. I can endorse that. But in the end, he was someone who made far more of an impact in politics than he ever did in pro wrestling. A lot of politicians in Finland after this ran on anti-immigration platforms for years after Halme's win. And there is a certain irony to that when you consider that Halme himself emigrated to the United States for a better life and to try to become famous. What he was, though, was a terrible person. He was a terrible person with few, if any, redeeming qualities. And that comes from the people who knew him best. And it's very telling when nobody has anything nice to say about you, even after you die. In wrestling, he was your run-of-the-mill, prototypical mid-card foreign heel who never caught on. And as quickly as he showed up, he was gone. And he will be remembered more for the things he did outside of wrestling than anything he ever did in it. Now, this Tuesday, the Dark Side of the Ring episode will be covering Big Van Vader, which I am very much looking forward to that one. Here's the schedule for all of the remaining episodes. We have Vader this week. April 15th, it is Tony Atlas, Too Much, Too Soon. April 22nd, Superstar Billy Graham. April 29th, Eddie Gilbert. May 6th, Billy Jack Haynes. May 13th will be the original Sheik. May 20th is the episode on Daphne. And I guess the season finale, May 27th, Muhammad Hassan. Those are the remaining episodes for season 6.